The server room hums at a frequency most people never hear. I'd spent 9 years learning to hear it. The difference between a healthy load and a system 3 minutes from failure. On the 41st floor of Etherline Stack, in a glass office nobody wanted because it faced the parking structure, I kept 200 client platforms alive without anyone noticing I was doing it. Idris Kane noticed the office. He'd been VP of engineering for 11 days when he stopped in my doorway, looked at my 3 monitors, and said the word that would eventually cost him everything. Quaint. He didn't know that the thing keeping his new title worth having lived entirely inside my head. Nobody did. That was the problem I'd never bothered to fix. I should have written it down. Instead, I let them believe the lights stayed on by themselves. I never wrote a run book. That was the first thing they'd say about me later, in the meetings I wasn't invited to. She never documented anything, as if it were an accusation and not a description of exactly how they'd wanted it. For 9 years at Etherline Stack, I was the principal reliability engineer, which is a title that means nothing to people outside the building, and everything to the 200 companies whose entire digital existence ran on our cloud. Hospitals scheduling surgeries, payment processors moving money, a logistics firm that would lose $4 million an hour if their tracking went dark. They all signed contracts with Etherline. What they were actually buying, though they'd never know it, was me. My name is Iona Strand. I'm 31. I came to Etherline at 22, straight out of a systems program, into a company that was then 40 people crammed into a floor that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. Back then, the founder, a soft-spoken woman named Rasa Petrova, used to sit on the floor of the server closet with me at 2 a.m, both of us tracing a memory leak by hand because we couldn't afford the monitoring tools that would have found it in seconds. "You have the ear for it," she told me once, tapping the side of her head. "Some people read the logs." "You hear the machine." She retired 4 years ago. I think about that sentence more than I've ever admitted to anyone. By the time Idris Kane arrived, Etherline had 1,100 employees and a marketing department that described our infrastructure as self-healing. I found that phrase genuinely funny. The infrastructure healed itself the way a patient heals themselves, while a surgeon holds the artery closed. What they called self-healing was a lattice of failover routines I'd written and rewritten over 9 years. The automatic rerouting that kicked in when a data center coughed. The load shedding that stopped a traffic spike from cascading into a national outage. The quiet, unglamorous machinery that turned "our platform went down for 6 hours" into "our platform never goes down." None of it was in the company wiki. That wasn't sabotage. It was history. When I built the first version, there was no wiki. When there was a wiki, the systems were changing faster than I could describe them, and every hour I spent writing documentation was an hour the platform ran without me watching it. So I kept it in my head and in a personal set of scripts on a personal directory, and in the muscle memory of knowing that when the pager buzzed at 3 a.m. with a specific 2-tone pattern, I needed to be at my desk in 4 minutes, or a children's hospital in Ohio would lose its patient record system. I told myself I'd document it properly someday. Someday kept losing to Tuesday. Idris Kane came from a company that had gone public and made a lot of people rich, and he arrived with the specific confidence of a man who believes his last success is a personality trait. He was maybe 40, wore expensive sneakers to signal he was still technical, and used the word modernize the way some people use a throat clear, reflexively, to fill space, to remind you he was in the room. Our first real conversation happened in a glass conference room called Halberd on the 39th floor, 2 weeks into his tenure. He'd called what he termed a reliability alignment session. I brought 9 years of context. He brought slides. "So here's what I'm seeing," he said, clicking to a diagram of our architecture that someone had clearly pulled from a 2-year-old presentation. "We've got a lot of, let's call it tribal knowledge, single points of failure that happen to be people." He looked at me when he said it, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. "That's a risk. Buses exist. People leave. We're going to modernize this. Proper documentation, proper on-call rotation, proper tooling, standard stuff. It's how grown-up companies run." A younger engineer named Theo nodded along eagerly. He was new, sharp, and had absorbed Idris's vocabulary within days. I liked him anyway. He didn't know what he didn't know, and at his age, I hadn't either. "Some of these systems are more load-bearing than the diagram suggests," I said carefully. "I'd want to walk you through the failover architecture before we change the on-call structure. There's context that isn't obvious." Idris smiled the smile of a man who has decided the meeting is already over. "That's exactly the tribal knowledge problem, though, isn't it? If it needs you to explain it, that's the bug, not the documentation." A couple of people chuckled. "No offense, Iona. This is a compliment. You've clearly built a lot. Now let's make it so we don't need you to keep it running." I remember looking at the diagram on his screen, a clean, confident, wrong picture of how our platform actually worked, and feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, something quieter and more patient. The recognition that this man was going to make a decision, and that the decision would be catastrophic, and that there was no sentence I could say in that room that would stop him, because the thing I knew couldn't be proven in a slide. "Sure," I said. "Let's make it so you don't need me." He took it as agreement. I meant it as a forecast. That night I stayed late, the way I always did, and I listened to the building empty out floor by floor. At 9:40 the pager buzzed, the two-tone pattern, the one that meant a data center in Virginia was struggling to hold a traffic surge from a retail client's flash sale. I fixed it from my desk in 6 minutes, rerouted the load, shed the non-critical traffic, watched the graphs settle back into green. 200 companies stayed online, and none of them ever knew how close they'd come. I sat there afterward in the dark, the monitors the only light in the office, and I thought about what Idris had said. If it needs you to explain it, that's the bug. He was right that it was a single point of failure. He was just wrong about what would happen if you removed it. The reorganization was announced on a Thursday in an all-hands that Idris ran like a product launch. New on-call structure, new reliability pod, new emphasis on sustainable engineering practices, a phrase that meant, when you translated it, that nobody would ever again be expected to know how the whole system fit together. My name wasn't on the new org chart. I found this out the way you find out about weather, from the general atmosphere, from a slide that flashed by too fast, from the way 2 people stopped talking when I walked into the kitchen on 39. My role, Principal Reliability Engineer, had been dissolved into a pod of 4 mid-level engineers who would own reliability collectively. Collective ownership. I'd spent 9 years learning that when everyone owns something, no one hears it failing. Idris scheduled a one-on-one with me for the following Tuesday at 4:30 in the afternoon in the small glass room called Falcon, the one they used for conversations they wanted witnessed but not overheard. I knew what it was before I sat down. You always know. There's a particular way HR schedules a meeting, the calendar invite with no agenda, the second name you don't recognize copied on it. The second name belonged to a woman from People Operations named Colette, who arrived with a folder and the practiced, sympathetic expression of someone who does this often enough to have a face for it. "Iona, thanks for making time," Idris began, and I noticed he'd brought a coffee for himself and nothing for me, a small tell I'd have found funny under other circumstances. I want to be straight with you because I respect you. We're going in a different direction with reliability. It's not about your performance. It's about where the org needs to go. Your role, as it existed, doesn't fit the modern structure. Legacy, I said. He brightened, misreading me. Exactly. And look, legacy isn't an insult. You built the old thing. But the old thing was one person babysitting a system that should run itself. That's not a job. That's a liability. He said babysitting like it settled something. We're offering a generous package. Colette will walk you through it. Colette opened her folder. Through the glass wall, I could see the open floor, and I could see Theo at his desk, very deliberately not looking toward Falcon, which meant everyone already knew. A senior architect named Boyd, a man who'd once called me at midnight terrified because he'd nearly deleted a production database, and I'd talked him through the recovery, looked up, caught my eye, and looked back down at his screen. That one landed. Not the firing. Boyd looking away. There's a transition expectation, Colette said gently. 2 weeks of knowledge transfer. Documentation of your key systems, hand off to the reliability pod. It's in the agreement. I almost laughed. 2 weeks to document 9 years. They wanted me to write down the machine's heartbeat in 10 business days and hand it to 4 people who'd never heard it beat. What if 2 weeks isn't enough to document it? I asked. Genuinely. It was the only honest question in the room. Idris leaned back with the ease of a man who'd never once been wrong in a way that cost him anything. Iona, respectfully, if it can't be written down in 2 weeks, then it was never really engineered. It was just you, and that's the exact problem we're solving. He spread his hands, pleased with the symmetry of it. This is why we modernize. So the company doesn't live or die on whether one person had a good day. There it was. The whole philosophy, stated cleanly. The company shouldn't depend on any single person. It was a good principle. It described a company Etherline was not. I signed the acknowledgement page because there was no reason not to. Colette slid me a printout of the transition plan, a checklist of systems to document, most of which were named wrong, some of which didn't exist anymore, none of which touched the 6 failover routines that actually mattered. They didn't know to ask about those. You can't put a system on a handoff checklist if you don't know it's there. I'll need my personal directory access through the transition, I said. Of course, Idris said. Whatever you need. And Iona, genuinely, no hard feelings. You're going to do great things. This just isn't the shape of the future here. I stood and I shook his hand, because Rasa Petrova had shaken a lot of hands over a lot of years, and I'd learned my composure from her. No hard feelings, I said. And I meant it, in the specific way that I felt nothing that needed to be forgiven yet. Back at my desk, I did something I hadn't done in 9 years. I stopped. Not dramatically. I didn't delete anything, didn't sabotage a line of code, didn't touch a single production system. Sabotage would have been a crime, and worse, it would have been a lie. It would have suggested I had to do something to make them understand. I didn't. All I had to do was leave and stop being the person who heard the machine. For the next 2 weeks, I documented. I wrote pages of accurate, useless prose about the systems on their checklist. I attended the handoff sessions. I answered every question they asked. Precisely, honestly, completely. They just never asked the right ones, and I had signed no clause requiring me to volunteer the questions they didn't know to pose. I had spent 9 years being the person who noticed what everyone else missed. Now, for the first time, noticing was no longer my job. On my last Friday, the pod threw me a small, awkward cake in a kitchen on 39. Idris gave a short speech about the shoulders of giants. Theo hugged me and said quietly, "I still feel like there's stuff I don't get about the failover layer." I told him the truth, which was the kindest and cruelest thing I could have said. There is. Write down every question you have. You'll want the list. At 4:52 that afternoon, I handed my laptop to IT, took my badge off the lanyard, and set it on the reception desk. Nobody walked me out. The two-tone pager pattern, the one that had run my life for 9 years, had already been reassigned to the pod's rotation. I imagined it buzzing in someone else's pocket some night soon, and that someone staring at it, not knowing what the two tones meant, not knowing there were 6 minutes on the clock. I walked out without a word. The elevator doors closed on the 41st floor, and I felt, for the first time in nearly a decade, the specific silence of a machine I was no longer listening to. They thought they'd removed a liability. What they'd actually done was pull the one thread that held the load. And the thing about a load-bearing wall is that it looks exactly like every other wall, right up until the moment you take it out. Let me stop here, because what happens next is the part I still think about on quiet nights, and I want to make sure you're with me for it. Here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever been the person who held something together so quietly that the people around you forgot you were holding it until they let go of you and everything they were standing on started to move? Tell me in the comments. One sentence, or the whole story. I read them. And if you felt even a piece of that, subscribe before you go any further. Because the next part is the Wednesday morning their entire platform tried to restart itself and couldn't remember how. The first outage happened 9 days after I left, and it was small enough that they fixed it themselves. I know the timeline because I still have friends inside the building, and because later, the incident reports became part of the public record in a way Idris Kane never anticipated. It started on a Tuesday night. A data center in Virginia, the same one that had coughed on my last week, hit a traffic surge from a payment processor's end-of-month settlement run. Ordinarily, one of my failover routines would have caught it in the first 90 seconds. Shed the non-critical load, reroute the settlement traffic to the Oregon cluster, hold the line until the surge passed. The routine still existed. It was still running. That was the thing nobody understood. I hadn't deleted anything. The machinery was all there. But the machinery had a dependency, and the dependency was judgment. The reroute script didn't fire automatically for a settlement run, because a settlement run looks, to an automated system, almost identical to a denial of service attack. A massive spike of near-identical requests from a narrow set of sources. If you rerouted it blindly, you'd amplify the load on Oregon and take down 2 clusters instead of 1. For 9 years, the person who decided reroute versus hold had been me at 3 a.m., reading the shape of the traffic and knowing the difference between a client getting paid and a client getting attacked. The pod didn't know the difference. How could they? It wasn't written anywhere. It lived in the specific memory of the specific night, 4 years earlier, when I'd guessed wrong and taken down Oregon, and had spent until dawn bringing it back, and had promised myself I'd never make that call by reflex again. That promise was the dependency. You can't put a promise in a runbook. So on that Tuesday night, the pod saw the spike, saw the pattern that matched an attack signature, and did the responsible, documented, modern thing. They triggered the DDoS mitigation, which throttled the payment processor's legitimate settlement run, which failed the settlement, which meant a mid-size bank's overnight batch didn't clear. It was a 4-hour incident. They wrote it up cleanly. Root cause, traffic misclassification. Action item, improve attack detection heuristics. They were, in a sense, correct. They just didn't know that the heuristic they were trying to improve was a woman named Iona Strand, and that she was, at that moment, sitting in her apartment drinking tea and not answering a pager that was no longer hers. I heard about it from Theo, who texted me, against, I'm fairly sure, explicit instructions not to contact me. Is it normal for settlement traffic to trip the DDoS filter? I looked at the message for a long time. Then I typed, no, it's not normal. It's a known edge case. And then I deleted it without sending, because I no longer worked there, and because the honest answer to his real question, how do we make this stop, was a 9-year answer, and they'd decided 9 years was legacy. I want to be precise about something, because it matters. I did not want the platform to fail. I'd built it. There is no version of me that enjoys watching a system I loved come apart, but I also understood, with total clarity, that the failure wasn't mine to prevent anymore. Idris had said it himself in the glass room called Halberd, with the confidence of a man reading his own epitaph and not knowing it. Let's make it so we don't need you. They had gotten exactly the company they'd asked for, a company that didn't need me. It just couldn't run without me, and those turned out to be different things. The small failures compounded. This is what nobody outside of infrastructure understands about the systems that run their lives. They don't collapse all at once. They fray. A settlement fails here. A failover mistriggers there. Each incident individually explainable, each root cause individually addressable, each fix introducing a new assumption that the next incident would violate. The pod was smart. They worked hard. They were, I'm told, in the office until midnight most nights that month, patching. But they were patching a photograph of the system, not the system, because the actual architecture had a shape that had only ever existed in one head, and that head was drinking tea in an apartment across the river. 10 days after I left, someone in the building finally asked the right question. It wasn't Idris. It was Boyd, the senior architect who'd looked away from me through the glass wall of the Falcon Room. According to Theo, Boyd stood up in an incident review in front of Idris and the pod and a growing crowd of anxious managers and said the sentence that started the panic. Who owns the cross-region failover logic now? And the room went quiet, because the honest answer was, no one. 4 people collectively owned it, which meant no one heard it. It had been running this whole time on momentum and luck and the residual stability of 9 years of tuning, a spinning top that keeps its balance long after the hand that spun it has let go. It was slowing now. Everyone could feel it wobble. That was the night Idris Kane pulled up my personnel file and saw that my access to my personal directory had, per the transition agreement he'd approved, been revoked at 5 p.m. on my last day. The scripts weren't gone. They were just mine now, on my own machines, legally, the personal work of a personal directory I'd built on my own time and never signed away. He'd been so focused on the org chart that he'd never once asked the only question that mattered. What does she know that we don't? And where does it live? Theo's last text that night was the one I did answer. He's asking if we can call you. I set the phone down. I let the tea go cold. I thought about Rasa Petrova on the floor of a server closet at 2 a.m, tapping her temple. You hear the machine. Then I picked the phone back up and typed 4 words. They can send it in writing. The email came on a Wednesday morning at 8:14 a.m. It was not from Theo. It was from Idris Kane, and the subject line was urgent, consulting engagement. And I read it twice slowly, the way he'd once made me feel small in a glass room by making me watch him not read my architecture. The email was a masterpiece of a man trying to sound casual while standing in a burning building. Iona, hope you've been well. We've hit a few reliability bumps as the team ramps up on the failover layer, and I'd love to bring you in as a consultant to help smooth the transition. Very generous rate. Can you talk today? No apology. No acknowledgement of the word babysitting. Just the assumption, baked into every line, that I was a resource that could be reacquired now that they'd discovered they needed it. I didn't answer right away. I want to tell you I agonized over it, but I didn't. I made coffee. I watched the sunrise hit the parking structure across the river, the ugly view from the office nobody wanted, which I could see from my apartment, which had always faced the same direction. And at 9:30 I got a different email, this one from Etherline's general counsel, a woman named Priya Adeyemi, and the tone was entirely different because lawyers don't have the luxury of pretending. Ms. Strand, it began. We are experiencing a service continuity event affecting a significant portion of our enterprise client base. Our records indicate you developed core failover systems during your tenure. We need to understand the status of these systems as a matter of urgency. Please advise your availability for an emergency call today with senior leadership, a significant portion of our enterprise client base. I knew what that phrase was covering. 200 companies, hospitals, the payment processors, the logistics firm that lost $4 million an hour when its tracking went dark. And its tracking, I would learn, had been dark since 6 a.m. that morning, when the Oregon cluster, under a load the pod didn't know how to shed, had finally cascaded into exactly the 2-cluster failure I'd spent 4 years engineering the system to prevent. By the time Priya's email hit my inbox, $2.91 billion in client service level agreements were in breach. Every one of those contracts had a penalty clause. Every penalty clause was now running, live, by the minute. I took the call. I want to be honest about why. Not for revenge and not for the rate. I took it because there were real hospitals with real patients, and whatever Idris had done to me, I was not going to let a scheduling system go dark out of pride. Rasa Petrova didn't build a company so I could let it hurt people to make a point. They put me on a video call at 11 a.m., 9 faces in a grid. Idris in a conference room I recognized, Halberd, the same room where he'd shown me the wrong diagram. Priya Adeyemi, composed, taking notes. Boyd, gray-faced. Theo in a back corner, and when our eyes met through the camera, he mouthed something that might have been sorry, and a face I hadn't expected. An older man, silver-haired, whom I recognized from the annual report. The chairman of the board. He had flown in. That told me everything about how bad it was. Idris tried to run it like a meeting. Iona, thanks for jumping on. So, quick context. We've got some instability in the cross-region failover, and we're hoping you can point the team to where the... Idris. The chairman didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Let her talk. There was a silence then that I'd waited 9 years to hear, though I hadn't known I was waiting. I set my coffee down off camera, and I told them the truth, which was the only weapon I'd ever needed, because I'd never had to invent anything. The reality was always going to be enough. Your platform isn't broken, I said. Every system I built is still running. The failover routines fired correctly this morning. The problem isn't the code. The problem is that the code was never the whole system. Half of it was the decision layer, knowing when to reroute and when to hold, which client patterns look like attacks but aren't, which of your 200 clients you protect first when you can only save some of them. That layer was me. It was never written down, because you had 2 weeks to extract 9 years, and you spent it documenting the wrong systems. You didn't ask about the failover architecture. You told me it was babysitting. Nobody chuckled this time. Idris's face was doing something complicated. I can get your platform stable, I continued. It will take me about 40 hours. I know exactly which clusters are cascading and why, because I designed the cascade protection you disabled without knowing you disabled it. But I need to be very clear with everyone on this call about what you're asking for, so there's no confusion later. I looked at the camera. You're not asking me to fix a bug. You're asking me to be the thing you eliminated because you decided a company shouldn't depend on one person. I'm happy to help your clients. I will not be rehired to babysit. Priya Adeyemi spoke, and I could hear the lawyer in her calculating the penalty exposure in real time. Ms. Strand, what would an engagement look like from your side? Not an employee, not a consultant on your rate card, I said. An independent firm, mine. Etherline licenses the failover architecture, the documented version I'm going to write this time, properly, on my terms, and retains my firm for critical incident response. You don't own me. You rent access to what I know at a rate that reflects what it's worth. And what it's worth, I said, and I let it sit for one beat, is currently on your screen. It's $2.91 billion, and it's counting up. Idris finally broke. It came out the way these things always come out, not as apology but as accusation, the last reflex of a man who cannot afford to be wrong. This is coercion. She engineered this. She sat on knowledge she was contractually obligated to transfer and let the platform fail to. I documented every system on the transition checklist your team wrote, I said. Completely and accurately. You can pull the pages. I answered every question anyone asked me. The failover architecture wasn't on the checklist, Idris. You'd have to have known it existed to put it there. You didn't. That's not my sabotage. That's your inventory. The chairman was watching me now with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between fury and a very cold respect. He turned his head off camera, and I heard him say quietly to someone in the room, "Where is the VP who signed off on dissolving her role?" And Idris Kane, 40 years old, expensive sneakers, the confidence of a man who believed his last success was a personality trait, understood, I watched it cross his face in real time, that the single point of failure in that building had never been me. It was him. I stabilized the platform in 38 hours, not 40. I want to be clear that I did the work well and did it fully because the version of this story where I let a hospital's scheduling system stay dark to prove a point is not a story I'd ever tell about myself. I sat at my own desk, in my own apartment, with the ugly view of the parking structure, and I brought Etherline's 200 clients back online one cluster at a time, reading the traffic, hearing the machine, making the 10,000 small judgment calls that had never fit inside a runbook. By Friday morning, the graphs were green. The $2.91 billion in breached SLAs stopped counting up. The penalty clauses closed. Somewhere in Ohio, a children's hospital's patient records loaded without anyone there ever knowing how close they'd come, twice, to losing them. Then I sent Priya Adeyemi my terms, and Etherline signed them, because the alternative was explaining to 200 enterprise clients why their platform had gone dark for a day and might again. My firm, I named it Petrova Reliability, and I told Rasa before I registered it, and she was quiet on the phone for a long moment and then said, "She hears the machine," to someone in the room with her, and I had to hang up before she heard me lose my composure. Retained a licensing and critical incident contract that paid more in a quarter than Etherline had paid me in 3 years. I documented the failover architecture properly this time. On my terms, owned by my firm. Licensed, not surrendered. Idris Kane did not survive the board review. It wasn't dramatic. Boards don't revolt. They proceed. There was a governance inquiry into how a single reorganization had exposed the company to nearly $3 billion in contractual liability, and the inquiry had a very short answer, and the answer had signed the transition agreement in his own name. He was gone within the month, in the neutral language of these things, pursuing other opportunities, a phrase that means the same thing in every glass tower on Earth. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The system had done it, the same way it had done everything else, cleanly, procedurally, without raising its voice. The pod stayed. I insisted on that actually in the contract. 4 smart engineers who'd been handed a machine with its instructions torn out and told to keep it running, they hadn't failed. They'd been failed. Part of my engagement now is training them, properly, over the years it actually takes, so that someday Etherline really can run without any single person, including me. That was always the right goal. Idris just thought you could reach it by subtraction. You reach it by teaching. Those are different things too, Theo texted me the week after it settled. You knew this would happen, didn't you? When you told me to write down my questions. I looked at that for a while. Then I wrote back. I knew what happens when you remove a wall you never checked was load-bearing. That's not prophecy. That's just paying attention. I sat by my window that evening with tea going cold in my hands, watching the light drop behind the parking structure I'd stared at for 9 years from the wrong side of the glass. I thought about the word Idris used on his 11th day, standing in my doorway, looking at the quiet machinery of everything he didn't understand. Quaint. Here is the thing nobody tells you about being the person who holds it all together in silence. They will call your work invisible right up until the moment it's gone, and then they will finally see it in the shape of the hole it leaves. I never had to raise my voice. I never had to break a single thing. I just stopped holding the wall and let them discover, the way you can only discover it by losing it, exactly how much weight I'd been carrying the whole time they thought I was babysitting. Some walls are decorative. Learn which ones aren't before you take the hammer to them.